For centuries, Russia held absolute power over Eurasia through geography alone. Every single cargo shipment traveling overland from China to Europe had to pass through Russian territory. This wasn't just convenient geography. It was billions of dollars in transit revenue flowing directly into Moscow's coffers. And more importantly, it was strategic leverage. Russia controlled the fate of entire nations simply by controlling the only road between Asia and Europe, but that era is ending. Right now, as you watch this video, Kazakhstan and China are building a completely new trade route that reaches Europe without ever touching Russian soil. Tens of billions of dollars in investment are flowing into this project. Railways are being laid down at unprecedented speeds. Ports are being expanded across the Caspian Sea. Ships are being built. And here's the critical part. There is absolutely nothing Russia can do to stop this process. Kazakhstan, which should be the Kremlin's closest ally according to every geopolitical calculation, is actively trying to erase Moscow from the trade map entirely. This is a story about how geography loses its power, how alliances shift in real time, and how the world's trade routes are being redrawn in ways that will shape global politics for the next 50 years. To understand why this is happening right now, you need to understand the geography first. For over 2,000 years, before maritime trade rose to dominance in the 15th century, Central Asia was literally at the very center of the world's most important trade network. That network was the Silk Road. This incredible system of trade routes stretched from China all the way to the Mediterranean, covering approximately 7,000 kilometers of overland distance. Merchants, goods, ideas, and culture flowed along these routes. Cities grew wealthy. Empires rose and fell. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was the center of human civilization. But then everything changed. Maritime trade routes became faster, cheaper, and more efficient. The Silk Road was pushed to the margins. Central Asia became peripheral to global trade. And Russia, which had conquered and controlled much of Central Asia, inherited this geographic advantage. The overland routes that remained all had to pass through Russian territory. For centuries, this was Russia's most valuable asset. Now, a modern version of the Silk Road is being built, and its length is nearly identical to the ancient version. It's called the Middle Corridor, officially the TransCaspian International Transport Route. This is a 4,250-kilometer multimodal trade route that starts from China, crosses the Caspian Sea by ferry via Kazakhstan, then reaches Europe through Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. The route uses 3 different modes of transport: railway, then sea, then railway again. 3 different modes of transport merge on a single route in perfect coordination. But here's what makes this route revolutionary. It never touches Russian territory. Not once. Not for a single kilometer. This is the first time in centuries that there's been a viable overland trade route from China to Europe that completely bypasses Russia. The idea itself is not new. Back in the 1990s, the European Union began researching this route through a program called TransCaspian, based in Baku. In 2013, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia officially established the corridor together. By 2016, the Trans-Kazakhstan Railway was completed. The Baku-Tbilisi Kars railway line was finished. The infrastructure was there. The route existed. But here's the problem. It was virtually unused. Why? Because Russia's geopolitical pressure was intense. Because there wasn't enough demand for the route. Because the infrastructure had serious shortcomings. Because the existing northern corridor through Russia was cheaper, faster, and more established. As of 2021, the middle corridor carried less than 1% of all China-Europe overland trade. Russia's northern corridor handled more than 86%. The corridor existed on paper, but in reality, it was a ghost route. Trains barely ran. Cargo volumes were negligible. Investments were minimal. So how did it transform from carrying less than 1% of trade to becoming the dominant route for overland China-Europe commerce? The answer is 3 massive geopolitical shocks, each one building on the previous one, each one making the corridor more essential and more viable. The first shock came between 2013 and 2014. China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, which was history's largest infrastructure project ever conceived. At that exact same moment, Russia annexed Crimea. These two events happened simultaneously, and together they gave the Middle Corridor its first real momentum. China was actively looking for alternative overland routes to the west, routes that didn't depend on any single country's goodwill. Europe, for the first time, was seriously saying to itself, we need to move away from Russia. We cannot depend on Russian territory for our trade. During this same period, Central Asia itself was undergoing massive change. The death of Uzbekistan's 30-year isolationist president opened the door to regional cooperation that had been impossible before. Projects like the China-Kyrgyzstan-Uzbekistan Railway came alive. Infrastructure projects that had been blocked for decades suddenly became possible. But this first wave of momentum wasn't enough to transform the corridor. Russia applied intense geopolitical pressure. China showed disinterest in some projects. Demand remained stubbornly low. The corridor was still marginal. Then came the second shock. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The West imposed heavy sanctions on Russia, and suddenly everything changed. Trade routes passing through Russia became a massive risk overnight. European companies couldn't use Russian territory anymore. Insurance companies wouldn't cover shipments through Russia. Banks wouldn't finance transactions involving Russian territory. Europe didn't just want to move away from Russian trade routes anymore. It was forced to. It had no choice. Central Asia seized this moment of opportunity. Cargo volume carried through the Middle Corridor increased fivefold in just 7 years. By 2025, the corridor was carrying 5.2 million tons of cargo annually. More than 80% of overland cargo going from China to Europe now passes through Kazakhstan's territory instead of Russia's. The route had gone from marginal to dominant in less than a decade. But there was a third shock coming. At the beginning of 2024, the Israel-Iran war erupted. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical maritime choke points, faced closure. Insurance premiums exploded overnight, freight rates fluctuated wildly, and suddenly, the reality that if one strait can be closed, then others can be too landed on the global consciousness. Maritime routes weren't as reliable as everyone had assumed. The Suez Canal could be blocked. The Panama Canal could be disrupted. The Strait of Malacca could be closed. Suddenly, overland routes that didn't depend on any single choke point looked much more attractive. In April 2026, a new daily record was set. 6 trains in a single day traveled from China via the Middle Corridor to Europe. 6 trains in one day. Each shock built on the previous one, compounding the effect, making the corridor more essential with each passing month. Now let's talk about the most critical country in this entire story, Kazakhstan. And here's where the narrative gets much more complex and much more interesting. Kazakhstan's situation is far more complicated than a simple "we're bypassing Russia" story. Kazakhstan shares the world's longest border with Russia. 7,600 kilometers of border. This border is both a geographic reality and a constant existential threat to Kazakhstan's independence. Putin had effectively declared Kazakhstan an artificial country back in 2014. He said that Kazakhstan was built on territory that never had a state before. He implied that Kazakhstan's borders were not legitimate, that the country was essentially a Russian creation. This was a direct challenge to Kazakhstan's sovereignty and independence. Kazakhstan's president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, responded to this threat by making a symbolic but powerful move. He moved the capital from Almaty, which is in southern Kazakhstan, close to the Chinese border, to a brand new city called Astana in northern Kazakhstan. This was a message to Moscow saying, "The northern steppe is ours. This territory is ours. We are independent." But this symbolic gesture wasn't enough to make Kazakhstan truly independent from Russia. The reality was that Kazakhstan remained dependent on Russian military and political support. This dependence became painfully obvious in January 2022. Fuel protests in Kazakhstan turned into a political crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire country. President Tokayev was forced to request Russian troops to save his regime. Russian paratroopers landed in Kazakhstan. The price of dependence on Russia was seen by everyone that day. It was humiliating and dangerous. But Tokayev brought a different Kazakhstan out of that crisis. He defined Kazakhstan's official foreign policy doctrine as what he called multi-vector simultaneous relations. This meant maintaining relations with Russia, with China, with the European Union, with the United States, with Turkey, and with Gulf countries. Full dependence on none of them. Balance between all of them. And the middle corridor became the infrastructure pillar of this entire strategy.